And so I'll say we're absolutely thrilled to have Bret Stephens deliver today's keynote address. Bret is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. He writes about free speech, foreign policy, climate, and many other topics of interest to the Hoover Institution. Bret is an engaging commentator. He's won several awards for his writing, including a Pulitzer Prize. I'll note from Bret's bio that he's been banned from Russia, and that means I looked it up, 11% of the Earth's land is off limits to him. It's inaccessible. But most of that is Siberia, so it's probably not too bad. So I'm looking forward to asking Bret the reason for the ban. Maybe he is tough enough to go to Siberia because he had a tooth problem yesterday and into today, and he's still delivering this keynote address even though he needs a root canal. And so I think that's the kind of guy that could make it in Siberia, I think. I was thinking about the eclipse and the timing of the tooth problem, and I suppose the ancients might believe that it was a curse that was related to the eclipse. So I don't know about the exact timing. So I met Bret last year at a forum in Miami on the environment and public choice. He delivered a fantastic keynote address there. And one thing I remember is I recall Bret saying he was puzzled why academics would invite a journalist to speak at their conference. And so I can think of three reasons. One, and it was mentioned earlier, is academics, especially economists, engineers, physicists, aren't known for their charisma. So you bring a journalist in and it's going to raise that level of charisma. That's one reason. The other is journalists, they operate in the real world and, are on top of current events, and they can help pull academics out of our modeling and out of our theoretical constructs. We sometimes like to say that, the real world is a special case that's outside the scope of our models. So Bret is going to pull us into the real world. The other answer is that not any old journalist would do. Bret is unique among journalists on how he seamlessly integrates academic thinking into his commentary on all current events, which is fantastic. He's a thoughtful scholar that works as a journalist, and that makes him a perfect fit. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bret.
Well, Nick, thank you for the really lovely introduction, and having been to Russia more times than I ever wanted to, I feel no need to ever return since I was banned. This is a particularly nice invitation because 36 years ago, when I was a teenager, my father was a fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I came out. I was then in boarding school in Massachusetts, and I came out to visit him and my mother. And being here, I got a sense of how you could marry scholarship and the life of the mind with a deep engagement with ideas that were consequential for human welfare. I remember going to a lecture by Milton Friedman. It was a great thrill for a budding young conservative at 15. And so the Hoover Institution has always had a place in my mind, memory, and heart that's very special. So thank you for the honor of the invitation. I have to say, when you invited me, it brought on a little bit of trepidation, Nick. I generally try to stick to safe and easy topics like the war in Gaza. But to give a talk about the media and the environment, which is what you asked me to talk about, as I've learned, gets you into seriously dangerous territory. Some of you may remember the thermonuclear reaction to my first column in the New York Times 7 years ago this month, titled "Climate of Complete Certainty." It's difficult terrain for opinion writers and for journalists to cover as well. Journalism isn't so different from academia, as I think I'll attempt to explain in the minutes ahead. So to talk about the media and the environment first requires a discussion of the environment in the media. And just to be absolutely clear, this is not about the New York Times. None of what I say is intended overtly or as a kind of extended subtweet of my colleagues at the newspaper. Media is a plural noun, and within the media, many great journalists do great work all the time. And I'd like to think a disproportionate share of those great journalists work alongside of me. But as in any profession, there are also habits, patterns, and trends within the media that are real and worth noting, and are often more apparent to those outside the institutions, some of you in this room, for example, than to those within. What is the habit that most typifies much of mainstream media today? I often think of the great phrase of the art critic Harold Rosenberg in an essay he wrote for Commentary magazine in the 1940s. The phrase is, "the herd of independent minds." The herd of independent minds are people who sincerely believe that they think for themselves, and yet whose attitudes, ideas, and convictions tend to travel along the exact same paths of the social circles, ideological camps, or professional groups in which they live and work. There is a herd of independent minds in almost any line of work. In finance, which helps explain the fiasco of the financial crisis, in intelligence, which helps explain the fiasco of Iraq WMD, and academia, which helps explain the fiasco that is academia itself. One of the problems with a herd of independent minds is that its members tend not to perceive themselves to be part of a herd. And that's especially true in my profession, which attracts idealistic people who think they are pursuing a moral calling dedicated to truth with both a lower and uppercase T. Every journalist I know takes a certain pride in, as they see it, an independence of spirit and an autonomy of mind, of not having become a part of the profit-seeking corporate world, even if, of course, it's corporate that generally pays their salaries. Now, sometimes this is true of journalists, and often it is self-delusion. Although news organizations invest a lot of effort in diversifying their workforces, at least when it comes to race, ethnicity, and sex, most of the journalists I've encountered in my almost 30 years in the business have backgrounds much like my own. Middle or upper middle class, educated at elite universities, socially liberal, rarely religious, rarely particularly connected to the places where they grew up, unless those places are Washington, D.C. or New York City. This expresses itself ideologically too, except for places like the Wall Street Journal's editorial board, where I used to work for many years. I can count on the fingers of one hand the journalists I know who gave me the impression that they were anything other than orthodox liberals or progressives. On more than one occasion at the Times, when I was alone with one other reporter or editor in an elevator, they have leaned in and, in a conspiring tone of voice, whispered, "I like your column." True story. Yet the principal way in which this herd of independent minds expresses itself is through the obsession with expertise and the reliance on experts. Experts say we need to eat 30 plants a week, goes one headline in The Guardian. Should you be worried about the bird flu? What experts say, is another recent headline at NBC. Experts say the economy is getting better, but consumers don't feel that way, goes a third headline, and so on. In some ways, it is normal and appropriate for journalists to rely on experts, especially in technical or scientific matters. But there are a few problems. First, and most obviously, which experts? The choice of an expert often becomes the mechanism by which reporters launder personal opinions through the voice of others deemed to be impartial. Second, is the expert really an expert? The word might mean something when it comes to, say, lofting telescopes into space or appraising the age of dinosaur bones, but the coin of expertise is a debased one when it comes to, say, economics, psychology, or the social sciences. Third, does the expert have diagnostic or prescriptive expertise? That is, even if he can explain a problem, does he have any claim on advancing a solution? And do the solutions have an ideological color? And finally, fourth, does the expert have an interest in advancing, if not his own personal interests, the power and influence of his field? The psychologist wants to see the world in psychological terms, the economist in economic one, the epidemiologist in public health terms. Perhaps climatologists think and act similarly. So here is a partial portrait of the environment in media. A little self-deluded, ideologically monolithic, prone to groupthink, and heavily reliant on the views of experts, especially those whose opinions reflect or confirm the assumptions and biases of the reporters themselves. This portrait of the media isn't a new one. If you followed news coverage of, for example, Japan in the 1980s, you might have been led to believe that it was only a matter of time before the land of the rising sun eclipsed, to use a term of the day, every other country for economic primacy. Plenty of experts, like Harvard's Ezra Vogel, were on hand to attest to the truth of the prediction. If you followed news from Israel during the Second Intifada, when I lived there as the editor of the Jerusalem Post 20 years ago, you'd be led to believe there was no possible military solution to the uprising. Instead, Israel defeated the Intifada, and there were nearly 20 years of relative calm. And now the experts tell us that there is no possible military solution in Gaza. And of course, there was the reporting during the pandemic, another case of reporters succumbing to the tyranny of experts who turned out to not always know what they were talking about, or who vastly overstated their case, or who offered confident prescriptions about complex public policy questions that were beyond their areas of expertise, or who injected their partisan or ideological agendas into technical or speculative questions. To take just one, and perhaps the most famous example of many, consider this headline in the Washington Post. Quote, "Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus fringe theory that scientists have disputed," was the headline from a young reporter named Paulina Ferozi. The article referred to the idea of a lab leak as a, quote, "conspiracy theory," and cited a professor at Rutgers saying, quote, "There is absolutely nothing in the genome sequence of this virus that indicates the virus was engineered." I wrote about that and other examples 3 years ago in a column titled "Media Groupthink and the Lab Leak Theory," which brings me straight to the second part of my remarks and the topic you've given me, media coverage of the environment. I should start by saying something positive. The media today cover the environment as never before, and this is a very good thing. I grew up in Mexico City, a city where you only had to breathe to know how much damage humanity could do to its own environment. One of my earliest memories was the wonder of learning that in the United States, McAllen, Texas to be specific, I could drink water straight from the tap. Decades of one-party misgovernance in Mexico had allowed the problem to go from bad to worse, and one of the ways in which democracy came to Mexico in the early 1990s was through the efforts of its nascent environmental movement. This means that in most major newsrooms, the environmental desk is well-staffed, gets frequent front-page attention, and has the resources to cover out-of-the-way stories that really should matter to a broad public. I think of first-rate reporting on, say, the environmental costs of palm oil farming in Indonesia, or the terrible unintended consequences of Britain's attempts to fight climate change by promoting diesel engines, or the valuable attention that the media have paid to the moral, economic, and environmental folly of biofuels. I could go on, but I won't, because in too many respects, the groupthink that bedeviled past coverage on stories like COVID also diminishes much of the media's coverage of the environment. Let's take the most obvious example, the environmental benefits, the alleged environmental benefits of electric vehicles. You have to make an effort to find media coverage of the environmental downsides of owning a Tesla or some other EV, but yes, you can find it. Conscientious reporters will acknowledge that the electricity EVs use has to come from somewhere, an electric grid still largely dependent on fossil fuels, And the various minerals in their batteries also have to come from somewhere, like cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, or lithium mined in Bolivia using massive quantities of groundwater. But you really have to search high and low to find the most important fact of all. A well-maintained regular car, that is a gas-burning car, is much less CO2 intensive to produce and can easily stay on the road for 20 years or more, while it seems EVs may have a lifespan of about half of that. In other words, with current technology, you would have to build many more EVs, perhaps twice as many, with all the environmental costs that entails, simply to replace the fleet of existing gas-fueled cars that we largely have now. Does this mean we shouldn't buy or invest in EVs? Of course not. They're cool. But in far too much of the coverage of EVs in particular, and of how to go green in general, the media leaves out something vital: trade-offs. Trade-offs between carbon intensity and energy density. Trade-offs between intermittency and renewability. Trade-offs between energy sources that emit no carbon but are also radioactive. Trade-offs between growing crops for energy and growing them for food. Nor are these the only trade-offs that far too much of the media coverage of environmental issues tends to neglect or downplay. Far more important is the trade-off between environmental concerns and the human concerns that go beyond and are often at cross purposes with purely environmental ones. The craze 20 years ago for biofuels helped move vast amounts of corn production from food to energy, one effect of which was to drive up food prices in poor countries, arguably contributing to the Arab Spring and the disasters that unfolded in places like Egypt and Syria after that. Germany's push toward renewables, the notorious Energiewende, has been admired around the world. Less well reported is what an expensive failure it has been, particularly for German energy consumers. Jacking up the price of gas as a way of getting people to abandon their cars helped create the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jacket movement in France, and arguably had a hand in Marine Le Pen's powerful showing in the last election. Forcing American consumers to buy electrical vehicles will impose enormous strains on the power supply that will likely cause prices to soar, with political results that liberals and progressives probably will not like. The list goes on. And while it would be wrong to say that the media never covers this, it is fair to say that it is rarely a focus of sustained coverage. The truth is, the history of the environmental movement is littered with bad or unworkable ideas, from blanket opposition to nuclear energy in the 60s and 70s and 80s, to the craze for ethanol, to various cap-and-trade schemes that became riddled with corruption. But that history rarely seems to inform media coverage of the latest ideas or proposals. Nor does the media do much to acknowledge that when these ideas fail on account of public opposition, that is not because greedy oil companies colluding with evil think tanks are manipulating public opinion. It's because people living in democracies, particularly those people in the working class, don't want the types of cars they like taken away from them, or gas prices artificially raised by government fiat, or entire industries shut down because they are seen as quote-unquote dirty. In this respect, the media replicates an error it made during the pandemic. During COVID, the interests of public health were too often considered synonymous with the public interest. Let me repeat that. The interests of public health were considered synonymous, identical with the public interest. So no measure was too extreme, no matter how flimsy the assumptions behind it, so long as it would, quote, stop the spread and, quote, flatten the curve. I won't go over all the ways this proved to be cruel, damaging, or unnecessary. You're familiar with them all. Nor will I go over the many ways in which, in the name of promoting the views of experts, the news media went along with all this, not only suspending judgment in the face of a national emergency, but also publicly mocking or professionally punishing anyone who disagreed with some of those views. Something similar happens all too often with media coverage of environmental issues. The interests of the environment are conflated with a public interest. Bottomless faith is invested in a few totemic concepts, like net zero or 2 degrees Celsius, per the Paris Agreement. select experts are routinely quoted to say that the goals are both achievable and essential, and that the only possible alternative to these goals is a global catastrophe that threatens the existence of life on Earth. The downsides of attempting to achieve those goals are routinely dismissed as a function of demagogic politics or nefarious insider dealing, as opposed to legitimate objections and serious problems that are the usual result when governments attempt to achieve by fiat what they cannot achieve with popular support. And people who disagree with that expert consensus are publicly mocked and professionally punished. Last week, when preparing this lecture, I went back and reread, for the first time in years, my First Times column, titled, as I mentioned before, Climate of Complete Certainty. In it, I wrote that, quote, warming of the Earth since 1880 is indisputable, as is the human influence on that warming. But I also suggested that many of the predictions on which climate science staked its claims were based on, quote, sophisticated but fallible models and simulations that should not be mistaken for facts. Claiming total certainty about science, I added, quote, traduces the spirit of science and creates openings for doubt whenever a climate claim proves wrong. Demanding abrupt and expensive changes in public policy raises fair questions about ideological intentions. Censoriously asserting one's moral superiority and treating skeptics as imbeciles and deplorables wins few converts. Those lines led to more than 40,000 people signing a petition demanding that I be immediately fired, not to mention about a year's worth of media fusillades from pundits and supposed experts alike. With a perspective of a few years, I still find that reaction astonishing, and also one that unwittingly demonstrated my point. I was trying to offer a fairly modest criticism of a certain kind of expert-informed media orthodoxy about climate coverage. Nobody had told me in advance that it would be treated as a cardinal sin, eliciting demands for immediate defenestration. I'm proud of my boss, James Bennett, for not caving to the mob. But I also worry about what it means for the overall quality of our reporting on environmental topics. Again, I want to stress that some very good reporting is getting done right now every day. But I also see very little of that reporting that goes against certain orthodoxies, which was typified by the reluctance to credit the power of the lab leak theory or the scorn poured on the Swedish model during COVID. What reporters are going to be willing to even cite dissenting voices in important environmental debates if it means they could run afoul of their editors or the preferred experts in the field? How often will editorial pages be willing to run op-eds from contrarian thinkers, some of them I see in this room, if they fear it will lead to canceled subscriptions or fired editors? What are we losing intellectually when we treat scientific debate as a matter of capital T truth versus capital D disinformation, rather than an evolving and competing set of hypotheses based on transparent and reliable evidence? Needless to say, this isn't good for our understanding of issues related to climate or other environmental concerns. Intelligent public action can't come from partial and slanted presentations of relevant information. The media, through what too often amounts to a kind of advocacy journalism, is too often failing to acknowledge just how difficult nearly any kind of climate change-related action will likely prove to be. A question that should be of supreme interest to everyone, conservatives no less than liberals, has been turned into a partisan cudgel, in part because so much reporting fails to come to grips with the legitimacy of difficult and contrary concerns. But it's also bad for the media itself. Only 18% of Americans say they have any trust in newspapers, according to Gallup, and only 14% in TV news. It's actually astonishing that it's even 14%. This loss of trust, which could ultimately be fatal to our business, didn't come from nowhere. It emerged, I think, because audience sensed what I've tried to describe here, a news media that too often has become insular, self-righteous, and a mouthpiece for an expert class that is often wrong, never in doubt, and too blind to the way their prescriptions can harm the very lives they purport to try to help. How the media covers the environment is just one corner of a much larger problem for journalism. A journalism that has increasingly come to be seen not as a disseminator of accurate, timely, necessary, and interesting information, but as a mouthpiece for a select group that thinks it knows better than most people and isn't shy about trying to shape the world accordingly. Democracy cannot do without great journalism. I'm proud of the profession of which I have been a member for almost 30 years. But the motto we journalists really need isn't democracy dies in darkness. It is physician, heal thyself. Thank you. And I see Professor Koonin right there.
Yeah, so I found a lot of resonance with what you said. Would you be able or willing to publish it, or the essence of it, or whether not in the Times or elsewhere, or is that career suicide?
No, I mean, I would absolutely publish it. I don't know if it's not the kind of format that it typically works in the Times. It's a 3,000-word speech. Most people start losing it after about 400 words.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm not afraid of publishing it. I'm assuming this is going to be streamed and posted, and I'm happy to give this speech to the organizers. Sir, in the back.
Yeah, a really nice talk. My question is, what's the alternative to appealing to experts? And I guess a related comment is, I mean, one alternative would be you get an expert from both sides if it's a contentious issue, but that's sometimes criticized as both sidesism, and there's different perspectives on that. So if not experts, what is the approach that journalists should take to researching and producing their material?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, obviously, this is more art than science. If we're going to be talking about biodiversity in the Amazon, we're probably not going to ask man-on-the-street questions about how they feel about. I mean, that's a kind of an Onion specialty, if you remember the Onion when it was funny. So there are clearly areas where expertise does matter and is relevant, and good editors will assume that certain areas require that if you're going to cite an expert from, say, the Brookings Institution, you should cite one from Hoover or the American Enterprise Institute. That happens only rarely, or when it does, people will cite Brookings, reporters will cite Brookings Institution person, whoever, and then from the conservative American Enterprise Institute, you get, Roger, someone else, right? So there's very little effort when experts are cited to make sure that competing voices are heard. But also, I think that there are a great many topics where reporters are either suspending judgment that they should have or limiting the ground of people who are supposed to have valuable points of view to a very select group. And I think it's incredibly interesting that the group of people who really did the hard work on looking at the power of the lab leak theory were a bunch of bloggers in New Zealand. And it took Nicholas Wade, a great science reporter who was basically drummed out of the business because he did some work on IQ, right, to raise this. By the way, much to the credit of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is not usually my first read in the morning, they published it. But there was, before all that, such a suspension of common sense throughout the entire profession, right? That we weren't remotely curious that this virus happened to start in precisely the city where this biolab had its home. And we didn't ask harder questions given what we know about the context of the Chinese government and the way in which it suppresses information, or past outbreaks throughout the communist world, an anthrax outbreak in the Soviet Union, I think in 1979 or sometime 45 years ago. because we just sort of handed it over to experts. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the journalism I do is kind of reclaim the right to common sense and normal questions in the matter of great public issues, because I think that's missing a great deal. If 80% of the country is telling you the economy is not good, but 80% of media coverage says it's great, but people are deluded, right? We should take a much closer look at why that 80% might not feel so great about their personal lives, because presumably the aggregate of human experience on a question like the economy is a more relevant question than what data from the St. Louis Fed is telling a handful of economists, in academic settings. Yes, sir. It's coming.
You made the point that you had the blessing of a good editor. Having worked with a lot of journalists for decades, the problem you described about what reporters that are doing and not doing falls on the editor. So do you have a sense of any shift, not with your editor, not necessarily in the Times, but generally speaking, my experience with reporters is they don't have good editors. And there's a lack of training and discipline from the editors themselves. You think that's going to shift, or is that the groupthink there is very strong, but it's also just sloppy, poor guidance?
The question is not about editors, although that's one question. It's about leadership in institutions and the penalties for publishing the wrong guy, or the ideal error rate in any intellectual enterprise is not zero, right? You have to be putting out, you have to be willing to push for, obviously you want a lower error rate, and you want to have structures in place to diminish the possibility of error, but you can't just try to get to zero, because what the result you get isn't flawless journalism, you get cowardly journalism. And so there has to be tone setting in the upper echelons of any great newspaper or media organization to say, we're going to take risks, and when occasionally our reporters get something wrong, we'll acknowledge the error, but we're going to stand by the reporters. There is, and I think this is true, Roger, I think, described this so well in his talk just in the last hour, but all of the incentives, unless you're very gifted, very tenured, or very old, all of the incentives are to pull back, to not speak, to play it safe. And I think that has degraded, my perception is it's degraded academia, and I think it's also degraded journalism. And bear in mind, this is an industry that 20 years ago had about 70,000 people regularly employed in journalism. Now I think it's around 30,000 people. So people are terrified for their jobs already. But one of the reasons I think the industry is collapsing, right, is because there is a perception that is a valid perception that the news that is produced is the safe and sanitized news coming from a particular point of view. And it's no wonder that people are kind of turning away or turning to social media or less reliable sources of news that at least communicate a sense of understanding what you are going through in your life. Just one last point, and I'd like to see some good academic research on this subject, but I am told by major metropolitan news organizations that crime in my city, New York, is down. And yet I go on the subway and I see that the governor has put in the National Guard in my crime-free city. Why? Because there's a problem, right? But what that problem points to is a real disparity, by the way, between what data tells us and what experience tells us. I'm fascinated by the fact that crime data as reported by police departments seems to suggest a leveling off or diminishment of crime, but the National Victimization Survey from the FBI has gone like this. And what that would suggest is crime is being committed at a higher rate, and people have no faith in the cops, so they're not bothering to report the crime because the arrest rates have gone so far down. That's a hypothesis. I don't know that for sure, but I would love to see some enterprising reporter ask those sorts of questions, and I don't see it frequently enough.
Bret, I want to thank you. That was fantastic. I want to pick up on something you were just saying of reporters competing with social media. At the same time, for your newspaper, for the others, there's a superstars technology of reaching more people than ever before. Mm-hmm. Does that have a selection effect? Are reporters more self-conscious that they could reach 1 billion people versus when I was in New York City in the 1970s and reading the New York Post?
I think it depends on the institution. There are certain media organizations that go out of their way to create stars who have their own brands. I'm not upset by that because I'm trying to create my own brand too, so I have tuitions to pay and, mouths to feed, as they say. But I admire, if I were devising a system, I think the best system is The Economist. No bylines. The reporter serves the institution, period. And the only thing that matters is the interest of the institution, not the individual reporter. I think that's a very fine way of doing this. Is that the nature of your question? Because
it was, but I'm also interested in scale of reporters now at the New York Times can reach the whole world.
No, I'd like, but you climb a certain mountain only to see that you've just climbed a foothill to the next mountain, right? So the New York Times has had this wonderful run going from, 2 or 3 million subscribers 10 or so years ago, don't quote me on this data, to I think north of 10 million now. Sounds phenomenal, right? But 10 million is what, 3% of America? It's not, Taylor Swift, that is scale, right? But even being a star at the Times, you're operating in a particular media bubble. By the way, I want to say, my impression of the Times is reporters hold themselves, and we are held to high standards in terms of our ethics, in terms of, you can point to all kinds of things you don't like, but remember that the New York Times publishes as many words every week as Shakespeare published in his whole life. But we are read with the same attention as Shakespeare. So when there's a mistake in the Times, there's a magnification effect that doesn't happen if, say, we were USA Today, where you assume everything's a mistake. That's a terrible thing to say. That was a bad joke, and I regret it. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if this is a defense of journalists and journalism regarding experts, but it seems to me that courts have the same problem sorting out experts, and their filters suggest that they're not perfect, I guess, as I think about it. I was involved in a court case in Montana this summer regarding whether Montana's policies were causing climate change. And in that case, it was just amazing. Everybody who spoke today could have been a witness in that case, and it would have fallen on deaf ears. And I thought the experts on the one side of the case seemed weak compared to experts on the other. I'm showing my biases, I'm sure, but and ultimately that leads to the question of how do you sort out experts? In the courtroom, there are some rules about expert witness testimony. Are there ways to other than just saying we have somebody from Hoover and somebody from Brookings, are there ways of sorting out experts that would help, especially with regard to the environment? And here I throw a soft pitch to Nick for the work he's doing, trying to sort out when are experts in the journals, academic journals, subjective or objective.
Yeah, look, when it comes to the courts, I know about as much as the next guy, an impression that a lot of the people who provide expert testimony in many courtrooms are snake oil salesmen or selling, I mean, it's a kind of an enrichment scheme, not independent testimony. Look, when it comes to the media, this is actually a real challenge because to the extent that we rely on experts, we also have to rely on the judgment of the community of experts to tell us who is the most eminent expert, right? And in the absence of, say, a Nobel Prize or some other trophy kind of attestation of genius or prestige, it's hard to do it. And it becomes, this is again an impression, that the experts that get cited most often are the most loud and aggressive people in the field. I could think of one person, but he'd probably sue me. But those are the sorts of people whose voices are heard. And look, there's another issue, which is that for a reporter, if I'm a reporter and I want a contrary take, I wrote a long piece based on a trip to Greenland a couple of years ago, and I went out of my way to cite Roger. I don't know if he agreed with everything I wrote in the piece, but I wanted to make a point of citing him. But it was, to some extent, a bit of an act of courage to cite Roger. Because, Roger is this, that, and the other, right? And I had to make a decision. I thought, you know what? I'm not going to lose my job over citing Roger, and period. I'm doing it on principle because he has done the chief legwork on on particular mortality data, which is incredibly valuable to the point that I was trying to make. But there is no doubt that a lot of reporters think twice, and this is especially true in the lower rungs of the profession. This is what I worry about. By the way, I think this is true in academia. It's the younger journalists or the younger untenured professors who are the ones who are playing it safe and playing the ostracism game because the reputational and professional penalties have grown so high for taking a risk, even in doing something as what ought to be as completely as innocuous as citing Roger's data.
So let's take 2 more questions.
There's one in the back there.
Thanks so much for the talk. My name is Ron. You've been in journalism for a long time, and some of the issues that you talked about, I wonder if they are a function of the economics of the media landscape, the fracturing of the audience, and the polarization politically. Those are factors that are contributing to what you described.
I'm sure it's all of the above, but one thing that there's a kind of I actually think it's connected to the social class from which journalists emerge. The Jimmy Breslins of the world, or Mike Roykos, if those are names that mean anything to, I hope, mean something, at least to the Chicago contingent here, right? These were not upper class guys. These were, or at least they certainly didn't affect that. I mean, they worked hard to appear like, working stiffs. And it inflected everything they did. It inflected the style in which they wrote, the concerns they shared, the kind of man on the street sensibility that they captured in a way. I would say I don't know what the percentages are. I would be interested to know, but I bet it's very high. The percentage of people in, say, the 3 or 4 most elite publications in the United States that they went to top 10 universities, and it reflects the assumptions and the prejudices, the distastes of people who come from that. And I think that shift was long in the making, but it's become much more powerful in the last 10 or 15 years. It's also become powerful because the generation that has graduated in the last 10 or 15 years didn't just come to the institute into journalism with an upper class pedigree and a degree from Stanford. They came with an upper class pedigree, a degree from Stanford, and an education in the history of settler colonialism, 1917 to the present, or whatever it is. So those three things, it's the character of the people in the institution which shape its assumptions and the way in which it operates. And I think the only way that changes is if newspapers start very, very consciously making an effort to get genuine diversity into their workforce. Ideological diversity and geographic diversity and class diversity being the ones that I have most in mind. And
One last question.
one last
Do you
question?
see it?
All right. On to drinking. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.